Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the Book of Judges. Now, this is a little bit of a longer reading, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here on the background information of the book like I did a few weeks ago with all the others, but I will, of course, give you just a little bit. Now, the Book of Judges was written most likely by the prophet Samuel. In this book, we'll find some pretty famous stories and characters, including Gideon, Deborah, that's right, a woman in the Bible, in the Old Testament, and Samson. This book covers a period of about 300 years, and in this time, they had 15 judges. Some were very good, and some were not. You'll notice here, though, that they had no king because God was supposed to be their king. Instead of a king leading them on earth, God appointed judges to help lead on his behalf. You'll notice, though, that God's people are now starting a cycle of doing evil, turning from God, getting conquered, and then wash, rinse, repeat, right? We'll see this happening over and over and over again. And we're going to see this as a common theme for a while here in this Old Testament. So let's get right into Judges here. In chapter 1, we start out with the tribes having to conquer their land that the Lord has given to them. We see that Judah and Simeon fight together and help each other defeat the Canaanites and the Perizzites. They even capture and mutilate a king, Adoni-Bezek. Lovely, right? Who essentially acknowledges, though, that he kind of deserves what he's got coming to him because of what he has done to others in the past. We also see here a story of a man named Othniel, who conquers some land and is the one that Caleb, good name, gives his daughter to, and then he gives he gives his daughter also a water supply so they can take care of their land, their livestock, and all that. So he gives them this water supply for them and their family. Verse 22 to 26 then shows us the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's kids, and that they are successful in taking Bethel, which is where Jacob has his famous dream in Genesis, which we're not at yet in Genesis, but we'll get there soon enough. But we see at the end of this chapter that despite all their successes, they don't finish the task, and they leave some Canaanites to live alongside them. This was a bad decision, and it will come back to haunt them sooner rather than later. In chapter 2, God confronts his people. Already, they are failing to keep their end of the covenant. As a result of their disobedience, he's now no longer going to drive them out and let these people be a thorn in the side of his people. And now they're going to have to show how much faith they have in God. Can they withstand living amongst these people that are worshiping other gods? And spoiler alert, the answer is no. So in verses 6 to 9, we see the death of Joshua. He had been a faithful leader, and even when his people around him began to compromise, he stood with the Lord. Now after Joshua's death, Israel's faith in unity quickly breaks down. Tribes merge with their Canaanite neighbors and worship Baal instead of God. Because of that, they suffer defeats at the hands of their enemies. God doesn't abandon his people, though. He gives them judges, leaders who are gifted in faith, strength, and wisdom. And these judges are going to rescue God's people from their predicaments. But every time they are rescued, they almost immediately rebel against God. This is a very stubborn, hard-headed people. So let's get into these judges. Let's look at them. In chapter 3, verses 7 to 11, we meet Othniel. God's people had done evil in the sight of the Lord, and so they are defeated in battle. Othniel is the nephew of Caleb, and God sent him to rescue Israel after they had cried out to the Lord after 8 years of captivity. Then we meet Ehud. The Israelites had returned to idol worship after Othniel had helped deliver them, and God allows them to be defeated once again. After 18 years of captivity, they cry out to God, and he calls Ehud to save them. Now, his story is pretty unique because he is a left-handed man, which means there's something weird about him. Just kidding. Sorry, lefties. And basically, this guy assassinates this king of Moab. And if you read about the king of Moab, it says in the Bible that he was a very fat man. And he stabs him, and his dagger goes all the way inside of him. So nice imagery there. And so that's a really interesting story. You need to read it. But he essentially assassinates this king. And while he, under the guise of, I'm coming in to pay tribute to you, to this king, and he assassinates him while he's in there. And make sure you do read that story there about Ehud. It's pretty unique. So after that, we meet Shamgar. We don't get a lot to read about Shamgar, but he kills 600 Philistines with an ox goad, which was something used for prodding oxen and looks like kind of like a longer version of today's fireplace pokers. I'll try and find a picture of it and pop it up on the screen. So then in chapters 4 and 5, we meet Deborah and Barak. Now, Deborah is interesting because she's a female judge and a prophetess, which we don't see too often in the Old Testament, though God does often use women to do great things. So after 20 years of oppression, they cry out to God for help, and the leader he sends them is Deborah. She calls for a man named Barak, and they plan to defeat Sisera, who is the commander of the foreign king's army, by basically luring their chariots into the river. Their chariots will come into this wetland, they will get stuck, and they will lose their advantage that they would have had over God's people. If you want more details on that, make sure you give that a read. But Barak says that he's not going into battle unless Deborah goes with him, and she agrees. What a stud. So the plan works like gangbusters. Their chariots are all stuck in the mud, and the leader, Sisera, flees on foot and takes refuge in the tent of a woman named Jael. Bad move. When he's asleep, she kills him by driving a tent stake through his temple. You heard that right. This man was asleep. He thought he was going to be safe, and she drives a tent stake through his temple. This victory was celebrated then with the Song of Deborah, which is what we see in chapter 5. All of chapter 5 is Deborah's song, praising the Lord for the victory that he has delivered them. And then that brings us to chapter 6 and a man named Gideon. I love the story of Gideon because he, for all intents and purposes, is about as unimpressive as you can possibly be, yet God still uses him to do something incredible. When we first meet him, he's threshing wheat in what's basically an underground cellar because he doesn't want the Midianites to find him and take his crops. Real tough guy. But an angel appears to him, and Gideon finds himself commissioned to be Israel's deliverer. And it's pretty cool because the angel actually refers to him as a mighty warrior. So Gideon's got to be like looking around like, who's he talking to? Can't be me. But he was talking to Gideon. And this is interesting because he's basically the runt of the litter in what's a very weak clan to begin with. But in God's sight, Gideon was already a mighty warrior. He knew what he could do, and he knew what he was going to use him for. It's a pretty cool story. Make sure you are reading it. Chapter 6, we'll hear about Gideon. So this first thing we see him do is to destroy the altar of Baal, which he does at night. Again, this is not a very bold guy. He's not very brave. In the middle of the night, he destroys this altar of Baal, destroys another statue to another false god, and he builds an altar for the Lord in its place and sacrifices a bullock to him. When the people wake up the next morning, they're upset. They want to kill Gideon. How could you do this to anger Baal? And Gideon's father steps in and is like, look, if Baal is this powerful God, let him punish Gideon. And of course, he doesn't because he's Baal and he's not God. He has no power. So he's just a statue. So then God wants Gideon to lead his people into battle, but Gideon is afraid. And he asks God for a sign, just so he can be really sure that God means what he says. And guys, Gideon's a little thick-headed here. All these things that God has already, you've met the angel of the Lord. For me, that would probably be enough. But Gideon he tests God not once, but twice. Look what he does. He puts out a fleece and says, God, make this fleece soaking wet and the ground all around it dry. So that night comes, and that's exactly what happens the next morning. He wakes up, he wrings the fleece, and he's got like a full bowl full of water in the fleece, and the ground is bone dry. And so he says, you know what, God, thanks for showing that, but just so I'm absolutely certain, why don't you go ahead and do the opposite? This time, let the ground be soaked and the fleece completely dry. And so the next morning, Gideon goes out, and God has done it again. And so that's where we are going to leave off this story. That's how chapter 6 ends. We'll see what happens next when we come back to Judges next week. I'll see you here tomorrow, though, in the book of Psalms.